Fire, and we should all burn together. Watch the flames climb high into the night. Calling out, Father, oh, stand by and we will watch the flames burn on the mountainside. Desolation comes upon the sky.
אשכחך ירושלים, תשכח ימיני, תדבק לשוני, הולכי כי אם לא אזכרכי. Now I see fire inside the mountain. I see fire where we should trees. I see fire, heart souls. I see fire.
Whoa. Meant to turn down the volume, not turn it off. Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. That was I See Fire by the a cappella group Kippah Live out of Jerusalem. How are you? How's it going? Let us light up the darkness. Who's in the house with us today? Melissa Eiteljurin says, good evening from Great Neck, New York. James Roth says, shalom from Indianapolis. Patsy White, hello from Columbia, South Carolina. Sandy McMurray, good evening from Michigan. Ed Berg, shalom from Galloway, New Jersey. Hadone Bizamat, hi from Manhattan. Randy Lieberman Herman, shalom from Florida. Stay safe, everyone, says Randy. Sharon Frant Brooks, Lila Tove from Lebanon, New Jersey. John Shore with us from Sedona. Brandon Christian Sullivan says shalom from Knoxville. Excellent choice of song tonight. Ed Sheeran is one of the best. So is that melody based on an Ed Sheeran melody? I didn't know that. Keep Alive does beautiful songs a cappella. And of course, they were singing tonight, I See Fire. It's their song about Tisha B'Av, when we commemorate the destruction of both temples on the same date in history and a host of other calamities. Tisha B'Av begins tomorrow night, Wednesday. We will be doing our annual reading on Facebook Live at 11 a.m. Pacific of the Book of Lamentations, which is traditionally read on Tisha B'Av. Who else is with us? Stephen Giger says shalom from Dover, New Hampshire. Patricia Nashpitz, hello from Chicago. Catherine Aduni, Atlanta, Georgia. Donna Smith says good evening from North Carolina. Arnold Albin is in the house from Northridge, California. Laura Kuhn says good evening from Laura, the OU state of Norman, Oklahoma. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago, loves the music prior to the teaching. Candy Rosen in the house from Denver. Bridget Crossland says love from Dallas. Marie Claire says shalom from Scotland. Michal Gallison-Corman says hi from Southfield, Michigan. Vaughn Billow with us from Fremont, Ohio. Lynn from Texas. Neil says shalom from Virginia. Lucy Johnson says shalom from Rochester, Minnesota. And Mirasia Janut says shalom, shalom from Atlanta, Georgia, and welcome back. Great to be with you, my holy brothers and sisters. Where are we holding? We are on Daf Kuf Mem Dalet. That's page 144 in Tractate Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 22 and continuing our discussion that we opened yesterday of Mishna number 1, the first Mishna in chapter 22. And we're going to continue with a question that we sort of asked and answered in passing yesterday, but we're going to look at more closely today. The question is, on Shabbos, juice that seeps out from a fruit. Okay, so we know we can't squeeze fruit, like we can't squeeze a lemon in order to get juice out of it in order to drink it, right? We can't squeeze juice from a lemon or from an orange or from a grape or from an olive to get that liquid, that juice or that oil out of it in order to drink it, okay? In order to drink it or use it as the liquid itself. We saw the exception that we could squeeze a little bit of lemon out of the lemon directly onto food, onto solid food, because then we're not taking the juice in order to drink it. We're just transferring it. This is the way it's legally considered. We're transferring a little bit of food from the lemon onto the guacamole or the salmon or whatever we're essentially seasoning with the lemon. We're not drinking the juice of the lemon in that situation. Knowing that, the sages also then decreed that if juice seeps out of grapes or olives or lemons, in this case where they're so typically used for juice, we're not allowed to drink that juice either because it was produced on Shabbos and it's too similar to what we would do if we did it on purpose. If juice seeped out when we were eating melon, we were just cutting pieces of lemon and eating of melon, right? Melon, which is not typically used as a juice fruit, melon is typically eaten as a food. So some juice came out of the melon while we were eating. If it already went into our mouth, that's no issue at all. But even the juice of the melon that collects in the plate at the end of eating the melon, we could drink that. It seeped out incidentally, but it came from a non-juicing fruit. So what about fruits that are sometimes used for juicing and sometimes used for eating as a food? If we can't squeeze them, right? So these kind of fruits like pomegranates and mulberries, that's the example that's given. So if in the case of these fruits, if we squeezed it on Shabbos to get the juice out, for sure that juice would be prohibited because it's prohibited to squeeze. It's prohibited to extract in that way. If the juice seeped out on Shabbos, then the answer was that it seems like it would depend on whether that pomegranate was designated as a juice fruit before Shabbos, right? Do we have pomegranates in our house to eat the food, in which case the juice that seeps out incidentally will be permitted, or do we keep pomegranates in the house in order to squeeze them and extract juice from them, in which case the juice that incidentally seeps out on Shabbos would be prohibited? That's the question that we're looking at. But now we're going to go analyze this question a little bit deeper. And because really what we're asking is, how do we know if the fruit was designated to be a juice fruit or to be a solid fruit? Until now, we just assumed, well, the person designated it one way or the other. But if he hadn't really thought about it, how do we know whether if for him it's designated as a juice fruit or a solid fruit? Now, to analyze this question, the sages are going to not exactly digress, but they're going to borrow from another area of Torah law. And this is going to be with respect to tumah, okay, with respect to ritual impurity. And here we have to learn a principle that I don't think we've encountered yet in our journey through the Talmud. I'm sure it's been on some daf, but I haven't explained it on our show on AT Daily. So we've talked about that food can become tameh, right? So food can become ritually impure. And specifically, we talked about the teruma, the portion of the grain that is set aside to be given to the priest. So we've got some grain. It's sort of like the best of the grain, the first part of the grain that gets separated in the tithing process, 2% of the farmer's grain yield, and it's going to be given to the priest. He's going to get the right to choose which priest to give it to, but he's got to give 2% of the grain he's harvested from his farm to a priest. That teruma, while it is awaiting to give it to the priest, or even once it's already in the priest's possession, we've learned that it can become tameh, at which point the priest can't eat it. The teruma is consecrated. It can't become unconsecrated. It's a problem, and then there's a whole procedure for what to do with it at that point. So we know that grain can become tameh. But now we're going to learn part of that process for a food, a grain in particular, or really any food, to become tameh, to be susceptible to tumah, to be susceptible to ritual impurity, it first has to come into contact with a liquid, right? If it's actually just dry grain sitting in a bag and it has not come into any contact with any liquid, that grain is actually tahor. It's pure. In other words, it's going to stay pure. It cannot become tameh until it comes into contact with a liquid. So here's a little bit of a protection, and this is in the Torah, right? So this is from God directly, that these foods are only going to become capable of becoming ritually impure, capable, susceptible to tumah, after they first have to come into contact with a liquid. Now, in the Torah, the only liquid mentioned is water. So it would have to become wet. The basic idea is that it would have to become wet, and only having become wet, having come into contact with water, and I don't think it all has to become wet, but just some wet water has to get into where the grain is, and now it becomes susceptible to tumah. So the rabbis expanded this definition of liquid from water, only water, to include 6 other liquids. So there are the 7 special liquids that, according to the rabbis, are going to render a food susceptible to tumah, right? So according to the Torah, only water can do it. But the rabbis look into the Torah and realize that it was not really clear that it was only intended to be water. Really what it was when it becomes wet. So water is mentioned, but things can become wet with other liquids. So now the rabbis are going to decree which other liquids are capable of rendering a food susceptible to ritual impurity, susceptible to tumah. The 7 liquids are water, as mentioned in the Torah, dew, which obviously is also water, but it's a different form, wine, blood, oil, honey, and milk. Those are the 7 special liquids that, according to the rabbis, a dry food has to come into contact with one of those liquids before it's even possible for it to become tameh. Now, why does it matter? Why is this related to our question of whether the homeowner's fruits, his pomegranates or mulberries, which we've learned that it makes a difference whether he had intended them to be juice fruits or eating fruits, because that's going to have an effect on whether the juice that seeps out of them on Shabbos on its own, incidentally, is going to become prohibited or permitted. Now, in this body of law, the liquids that can render a food susceptible to tumah, we're going to see why the rabbis go over here to borrow sort of principles from that body of law. Now, this list seems straightforward. Water, dew, wine, blood, oil, honey, and milk. Okay, we get it. We know what those 7 liquids are. It's pretty easy to understand what they are. But it's not so simple, because this list of 7 liquids, it was an expansion of what was in the Torah, according to the rabbis, to make sure that we're covering situations where food becomes wet, right, with a liquid that may not be water. So because the rabbis are already expanding that list, and now, right, this is because that list is bigger than just water, it's going to become possible for food to become tameh and possibly not edible, at least for some parts of the population, because it's ritually impure. The rabbis are going to be careful to limit the scope of their expanded definition of what a liquid is, right? So if the rabbis are going to decree that more liquids, a greater number of liquids, are capable of making a food impure and thus off limits to some people, so then therefore, they're going to limit the scope of their expansion. And as we'll see, how do they pick those 7 liquids? I mean, there are other liquids that are not on the juice. Right now we're talking about fruit juice, not on this list. So where do they get the fact that, which Jews make it which liquids make it onto the list and which don't? Where does that come from? And so for the rabbis, they're going to look to verses in the Torah. We're not going to go through them today, but there's a specific verse that they rely on, or Talmudic exegesis, right? So the standard principles for applying one law from one area in the Torah to another area in the Torah. And that's where they're going to get to those 7. They're going to rely on verses in the Torah to tell us which 7 are on the list. But in addition to whether a liquid is on the list or not, period, there's also going to be an issue of volition. Volition, meaning, did the person have in mind, A, that the liquid come into contact with the food? If he didn't, if it was accidental contact, that's actually not going to render the food susceptible to tumah. And second, in terms of the liquid being created, did the person intend for that liquid to be created? So even though wine, which comes from grapes, and oil, which comes from olives, are liquids that will render food susceptible to tumah. It won't make the food impure. It'll render it capable of becoming impure. If that oil or that grape juice in this case came out of the olives or the grapes, not by the owner's volition. In other words, he had just a bunch, he's harvesting his olives, let's say, and his workers are out in the field and they pick, hundreds of thousands of olives into baskets. And now they're just waiting for the baskets to take it into, the olive press where he's going to press his olive oil. But right now, the olives have just been gathered and they're sitting in baskets waiting for the next step in production. And while they're in those baskets, some oil is going to seep out of those olives. We could call it olive discharge. That liquid is incidental. It wasn't by the owner's volition that stuff came out of the olives. And so that extract or that discharge of the olives will not, if it touches dry food, make it susceptible to tumah, susceptible to ritual impurity. Right, so what is the case? If you just imagine it, so there's a farm. He's got one area of his farm. He's got olive orchard. He's going to pick a bunch of olives there. Another area of his farm, he's got wheat growing, and he harvests all his grain. He's got bags of grain, right? Now, if liquid comes into contact with that grain, it has to be somehow that he wanted it to happen, and it has to be a liquid that he wanted to be created. And then if it comes into contact with this stuff, now it's susceptible to impurity. What would actually make it impure is if a sheretz, a creeping thing, went into one of the bags of wheat, or somebody who happened to touch a dead body for some reason came along and touched that bag of wheat. Then it would become tameh, and then we would have to deal with that bag, which is now ritually impure. That's the case. So it's a lot of different things that have to happen. For now, what we're just dealing with is this idea of volition. That the liquids, even though they're on that list, if they weren't created according to the volition, it wasn't voluntary for the owner for that liquid to come out of the olives or out of the grapes, so then it's not going to render the food susceptible to tumah. On the other hand, after the olives are taken into the olive press, and a whole bunch of olive oil gets pressed out of those olives, and then they take all the olive oil out and they put it into jars, etc. And then there's what's left after the olive oil extraction process. So from the all the crushed olives that are taken out of the press and just kind of left in the pile after the pressing, from there's going to be some more oil that's just going to seep out of the olives that have already been pressed. That's just a natural occurrence from the olive oil making process. That's inevitable. That's going to happen. And so the oil that seeps out of the post-pressed olives, which is an inevitable occurrence, that oil would render food susceptible. Even though it's not like he had intent, I want to get more oil out of those olives. It's just so predictable that it's going to happen, and he can't get the oil that he definitely does want out of the olives without having some of that come out. So that oil is considered that it will render the food susceptible to tumah. Okay, other cases like this. If we're talking about blood, blood is one of the liquids that if it comes into contact with food, it can make it susceptible to tumah. However, blood that it comes, if we're talking about an animal's blood, when we slaughter the animal, a kosher animal that we're going to cook and eat, the slaughtering has to be done by a shochet, by a kosher butcher, right? A kosher slaughterer. He's going to make a very clean, largely painless cut in the animal across its throat. And then blood will gush from that wound and the animal dies. It is prohibited, absolutely forbidden in the Torah, to eat the blood of an animal, the blood that comes out when an animal is slaughtered. That blood that comes from the wound is capable of rendering food susceptible to tumah. But if the animal is just wounded in some other way, it was walking past, walking in the barn, and there was a nail sticking out of, out of the stall for some reason, and it just cuts itself in passing, and some blood drips out of a wound. So that blood, that accidental blood, is not considered, that it will not render food susceptible to tumah. The rationale of that we'll get into later in our journey, but the fact is the blood from an incidental wound does not render food susceptible to tumah. The blood from the site of the slaughter at its neck would render, if it came into contact with food, would render it susceptible to ritual impurity. On the other hand, mother's milk, human mother's milk, is a liquid like milk of any kind that would render any food it comes into contact with susceptible to tumah. And it wouldn't matter whether the mother expressed it on purpose because she wanted to, maybe store some milk for the baby for later, or just, some milk kind of expressed itself because it had been a while since the baby had a meal. In either case, that liquid is capable of rendering food susceptible to tumah, just like water is. Right. So now we get back to our question. The juice that seeps from fruits that are not designated for juicing, in light of what we've been talking about, that there's this element of volition in that area of the law that has to do with liquid that can render food susceptible to tumah. In some cases, some of those liquids only work if there's an element of volition, that the homeowner, the person who's involved here, wanted the liquid to be created. So here, in the case of this fruit, that it's not clear whether it was designated as a juice fruit or not, does he have to have an intent in mind that he wants to set those fruits aside, that he thinks of those fruits as juicing fruits, and he has to purposefully think of them that way? Or is it enough that some people consider, let's say, pomegranates to be juice fruits, to be primarily juice fruits as opposed to eating fruits? Does it matter that whether or not I think of them that way, that there are people in the world who really only think of those fruits as primarily for juicing? And so we're given the example of the home of Menashe bar Menachem. In the house of Menashe bar Menachem, it was common to take pomegranates just for the purpose of juicing them during the week. And so that would seem to imply that maybe those are really juicing fruits, even though some people eat them. Maybe they're primarily juicing, or at least there's a significant number of people out there that consider them juicing fruits. And therefore, if I haven't thought about why I have pomegranates in my house, whether for juicing or for eating, maybe the juice that incidentally seeps out of them on Shabbos should be considered prohibited, because at least some people consider those fruits to be primarily juicing fruits, like olives and grapes. And so the food, the juice that seeps out on Shabbos, it's like it was extracted from a fruit that's normally its purpose, and the rabbis are going to decree that we can't drink it to protect us from ending up in a situation where we kind of allow those fruits, put them in a place where they're going to be maybe a little bit smushed. There's going to be a weight on top of them. like we'll be tempted to leave them in such a way that juice will seep out of them, so we'll drink it. And the rabbi's decree is to protect us from putting ourselves in that situation. So now we're looking at the question, should we think of everybody's pomegranates as juicing fruits? Because this one, well-known, prominent household, for them, they always consider pomegranates to be juicing fruits. So now we take an example from another area of the law, and we look at, we've seen this before, the prohibition of growing diverse kinds in the same plot, kilayim. So in this case, let's say we have a vineyard, and we're growing wine grapes in this vineyard. Okay, in that vineyard, we can't grow other crops, any other crops. We can't grow wheat in the vineyard. We can't grow beans in the vineyard. We can't grow peas in the vineyard. Only grapes get grown in the vineyard. But other plants can just grow there on their own, and we're not going to worry about it. Now the question comes up, thorns, right? So these like thorny plants, which are basically a weed. I think when we talk about thorns here, we're talking about a specific plant that's a thorny weed, and that people don't really care about. It just kind of grows wild, especially in the Holy Land. And it's very typical that in a vineyard, in the areas that you weren't careful where the vines were growing, other stuff could grow just incidentally there, grass and thistle and thorns, this kind of stuff. Now, it turns out that in Arabia, the people who raise camels will actually cultivate thorns. It's a very cheap, easy to grow plant as camel fodder. So now that some people in the world, even a large group in Arabia, are growing thorns as camel fodder, should I think, well, then the thorns that grow in my vineyard shouldn't be there, and I'm violating the prohibition on growing diverse kinds in my vineyard because they do it there. Should I be concerned about doing it where I am? And the answer ultimately is, if camels are raised in my region, then it's something to think about, right? Then it might be in my mind that, oh yeah, that's camel food. But if in the part of the world where I live, no one is using thorns for camel food, just the fact that somewhere else in the world people use thorns as camel food is not going to be relevant to me. So if I live in an area where people do not raise camels, then the thorns growing in my vineyard is not going to become a problem. It's not going to violate that Torah prohibition. And then even once it's growing there, I didn't cultivate it. I can't plant the thorns there on purpose. But if it grew there on its own naturally, and I want to let my animals eat it, that's actually going to be okay because I didn't make that happen. It's just a plant that grows wild there. If, however, camels are raised in my part of the world, then I would have to make sure, okay, you know what? It might have happened naturally, but I got to get those thorns out of my vineyard lest I come to violate this Torah prohibition. And now we come all the way back to our question about pomegranates. And so the law on pomegranates, the law on pomegranates ends up being as it was before. As we looked at it a little bit before, now we simply understand it better. Let me just make sure I have it in front of me to read it properly. Come on, where's the halacha? It is prohibited to squeeze liquid from olives and grapes on Shabbat. If juice seeps from them on its own, it is prohibited to drink or use the juice on Shabbat. It is also prohibited to squeeze mulberries and pomegranates on Shabbat. If juice seeps from them, it is prohibited to drink the juice if the juice was designated for juicing. However, if the fruit was designated for eating, the juice is permitted, and this halakha is in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel. So we knew that, and the question is it going to be designated for us or not? And where do we ultimately come out on this? Does he say it or not? Just checking here. I guess the halacha isn't ultimately given. And so in this case, what it's going to be, if we just read right here, Rava said to Rav Nachman, is Menashe ben Menachem one, a Tana, that you say that the halacha is in accordance with his opinion? And if you say that Rav Nachman meant that the halacha is in accordance with this person, we ask, does it make sense that because he held in accordance with the practice of the people from the house of Menashe ben Menachem, that the halacha is in accordance with his opinion? Menashe ben Menachem does not constitute the majority of people in the world. Since most people do not squeeze pomegranates, the practice of the people from the house of Menashe ben Menachem should be irrelevant relative to the typical practice of others. And since we see, I guess it's not given here what the final law is, I'm not seeing it, but it looks like it's going to be similar to the law of thorns, right? So if we live in a place where a lot of people, a really significant number of people, are using pomegranates as juice fruits, okay, then, if we happen to have pomegranates lying around and juice seeps out of them, it's going to be prohibited to us on Shabbos. If we know, like in our house, we use them for eating, then it's not going to be a problem. It really is incidental. But normally the case that pomegranates are not considered juice fruits unless the person did positively designate them as juice fruits in his or her home. And that seems to be where we end up on this question. Okay, let's look at your comments and questions. Randy Lieberman Herman, please say a Mishaberach for Ruchalea Bas Yisraela. Thank you. May Ruchalea Bas Yisraela have a complete and speedy recovery of whatever is ailing her. And I'm so sorry, I forgot. I did have in mind, I just got thrown off when the music cut off at the top, that we're dedicating today's learning. Today's the 1-year anniversary, the yard site of Ahava Emuna Lang, a really beautiful soul, a great writer, mom of 5 kids who died of cancer a year ago. She's a great mommy blogger, a really, really, really beautiful person. Our heart goes out to her kids and to her husband, David Lang, who runs the blog Is Really Cool in Israel. It was a big loss for the world. And we hope that the learning that we do today helps her neshama, her soul, have a great elevation in the world of souls. Today's learning is dedicated to Ahava Emuna Lang. Neil asks, can you squeeze a lemon onto a teaspoon of sugar before you add it to your tea? That's an excellent question. I think the answer might be yeah, because I did see in today's discussion, I didn't cover it, but you can milk an animal, right? You cannot milk an animal on Shabbos in order to have milk to drink. You can't do that. We actually can milk an animal if the animal is in pain and it needs to be milked so that it won't be in pain. But we can't milk to get milked in order to drink it. But you actually could, now for sure this is on a festival, and I think it might be on Shabbos as well, that you could milk, just to get a little bit of milk onto a piece, and you could put it on a piece of bread so that the liquid is landing on a solid. That's the key. The liquid has to land on a solid. So just like you can take some juice out of a lemon and it lands on your guacamole or on your salmon, you could take a little bit of milk out of a goat or a cow, and it for it to land on your, I don't know if cereal would work. I guess it would, but onto solid food. The key is onto solid food. So here, if you're going to take, a bit of your lemon and go onto the sugar, which is clearly a solid food, and then into the tea, I think that might work, but I'm not sure. It sounds to me like it would work, but I'd want to check it. Bill Eldridge. All right, I think I may have gotten confused here. I was given to understand that creeping things could make wheat impure. If so, I can see how that would be liquid, either from sweat or urine. But surely no one intends that a mouse gets into one's dry goods. Exactly. Well, it's not that you intend that the source of tumah, of ritual impurity, touches your food. What you somehow intended is that the liquid contacts your solid food, that would make it susceptible to impurity, right? The liquid only makes it susceptible to impurity. So somehow you intended or allowed it to happen with your knowledge. That liquid came into contact with the dry food. Now it's considered ready for tumah or susceptible to tumah, able to become tameh. And then if the source of tumah, the source of ritual impurity, came into contact with that food, then it would become tameh. So one would ask, wouldn't you just keep that tumah dry? For sure, right? Like you would keep the grain dry so that it wouldn't be susceptible to tumah. And I guess the answer is if you knew that it was in a place where dew could get to it, or some other reason, that you didn't mind that liquid came into contact with it, so then somehow, now it's ready, now it's susceptible to tumah. Now you're just hoping that it doesn't become tameh because something comes into contact with it that brings the ritual impurity, including, by the way, the ritual impurity imparted by a zav. So like a man who has had a nocturnal emission has tumah. He's now tameh. He has ritual impurity, and he's a source of transmissible ritual impurity. And that kind of impurity can be transmitted not just by touching it, but even moving it. Even if he didn't touch the bag of grain, but he caused it to be moved, he could impart impurity to it, but only if it was already susceptible to impurity, that it somehow came into contact with one of these 7 liquids. Okay, Lynn asks, with all the discussion of olive water as a beverage, were they really drinking olive oil besides using it in the other ways? I'm not sure about olive water. Are you reading the Talmud or talking about in modern times? Here in the corn, I think they're talking about olive discharge. And we're talking about like not the olive oil that comes out of the press, but just what seeps out of the olives, right, on Shabbos or before the pressing, right, when it's just lying in the fields. It's going to be prohibited to drink, but it's not going to make food ready for tumah, right, until it's the liquid that seeps out after the pressing. See, when the rabbis borrow to understand, the law of volition in this case, and they're borrowing principles of volition from the liquids that render a food susceptible to tumah, like we have to be very careful, and they have to be very careful. This page, by the way, was super confusing. It's one of those places in the Talmud, and there's many, where they start to state a principle, and before they work it out, like if it was a presentation, would say, okay, these are the elements, and this is how it works, and in this case it would be like this, and in that case it would be like that. And before they finish that discussion and make a clear presentation of it, they move on to another question, and then another question, and as we'll see tomorrow, they go off, because one sage makes a point about the question under discussion, and then that same sage talks about another matter of law, and then they're off, for a whole page on something that has nothing to do with the question at hand. That's the Talmud. That's just the way the Talmud works. It's meant to be memorized and drawn from in teaching, right? In oral teaching. Remember that the Talmud isn't the oral law. It's like a tool for learning the oral law. It's a coded and super terse version of all these teachings, but we have to get in there and wrestle with it ourselves to try and understand it. Brian of Bloomfield, a pomegranate is also a source of dye. Very good. If we lived in a place where the fruit was used as dye or as another non-consuming product, does that alter its status? Now, this may be one of the reasons why also on this page, they went into a whole other area of the law about liquids that if they're added to a mikvah, and a mikvah has a minimum measure, it has to be 40 sa, of water in there for it to be a mikvah, and it can't be drawn water or rainwater. It has to be flowing water, either in the ocean or a river, or a specially constructed mikvah that water is sort of always flowing through it. And so if we add drawn water to it, and it makes up part of its volume, it will invalidate the mikvah. If we add other liquids, if we have the minimum measure of 40 sa of liquid, but we add beet juice to it. Now you can't make a mikvah out of beet juice. If you add beet juice to a mikvah that otherwise satisfies the requirements of it, how much beet juice do you add before it invalidates the mikvah? A mikvah is for an immersion, right? So that one who is tameh can become tahor, one who's ritually impure. Part of his procedure for becoming pure again, ritually pure, is to immerse in a mikvah. And a mikvah can be invalidated if we add enough of a non-water, mikvah is only water, but if you add some other liquid and it changes the color of the mikvah, then that's going to be enough to invalidate it. The rabbis are going to look at that body of law to ask a little bit more about these liquids. I'm not going to go into that today, but on your question, if the pomegranates are around for the purpose of dyeing, okay, I'm not sure, but here's my guess. It seems to me like if you've got pomegranates around because you use them for dyeing, so that's definitely a labor of the week. You don't have them for eating. You have them for working. So, right, what does that tell you? That those pomegranates are probably muktzeh. We can't touch them at all. On the other hand, maybe because pomegranates are so normally eaten, we can eat them. I'd have to think more about that. You know, how particular is this person about his pomegranates used for dye? Can we then go and eat them? I'm not sure what the answer is, but that's where the problem lies. And then the juice that incidentally seeps out of them, you know, I'm not sure, but I'm going to guess it's just going to be prohibited. That seems to me like it's going to be prohibited. Okay, Lucy Johnson says, so the juice prohibitions seem tied to local culture and personal habits. And that's what's so interesting about all of these laws, right? I mean, you know, there are some things that are strict liability offenses. If you do it, you know, you're guilty, it's a problem. But so much of Torah and Talmudic law depends on volition. And that's what our question was all revolving around today. What was the person's intent, right? And that's why you can see that this really is a spiritual body of law. It matters what the person had in mind. Again, if you violate these laws, I mean, no one's even going to know. You could ask, what difference does it really make? And it matters because the person is pious. The person wants to know how to do the right thing. The person wants to know how to do the right thing in this complex and confusing situation. And for him to have a chance of doing the right thing, he's going to have to study these laws and come into contact with the process and wisdom of the sages. And in so doing, he'll also come into contact with all the ethical teachings, etc. And finally, Carolyn Dobson Chavez says, an aside, you might find interesting that Malcolm Gladwell has a recent new revisionist history podcast about restoring art back to Jewish families who had to sell it under duress during the Holocaust. It's definitely an aside, but you know, I really would love to see that all those families who had their property stolen from them in the Holocaust, including my family, you know, would somehow find a way to get those precious heirlooms and property back into the hands of their owners. That would be beautiful. My friends, tomorrow night begins Tisha B'Av. It's going to be a fast, a 25-hour fast like Yom Kippur. So that'll begin at sundown tomorrow. We won't be eating all through Thursday. It's a tradition to study late into the night, tomorrow night, Wednesday night. It's a tradition to read the book of Lamentations on Tisha B'Av. And we will be doing that on Thursday morning at 11 a.m. Pacific here on Facebook Live. Tomorrow, I think as part of our class here, our AT Daily, I'll also tell the story of Kamza and Bar Kamza, which is a family drama that led to the destruction of Jerusalem. A fascinating and dramatic story told in the Talmud. And then on Thursday, we'll have our regular show of Tisha B'Av is not a holiday in the sense that you can't go on screens and do work. We try not to work, but you can certainly teach Torah on Tisha B'Av. It's even better to do that. And then we'll start, and then the sort of the feeling and the mourning that we've been in for these 3 weeks, it even lingers beyond Tisha B'Av and goes into Friday morning. But by Friday at noon, we're out of that Tisha B'Av world. and we'll be really ready to start celebrating and get ready for Shabbos Friday afternoon with God's help. It's great.